It was the night of September 3rd, 2011, in Duluth, Minnesota. A college town on the edge of Lake Superior. Quiet, steady. The kind of place where people thought nothing truly dark could happen. But that night changed everything. Emily Carter was 23 years old, a law student with her whole future in front of her. Around 11:30 p.m., she left a friend's birthday party at a local bar called Harbor Lights. She wasn't drunk. She got into her red Honda Civic and she started the short drive home. A witness saw her headlights disappear as she crossed the North Shore Bridge over the water. And then, nothing. Emily never made it home. No phone calls, no text messages, no car. No trace of her. By morning, her family knew something was wrong. Her mother's calls had gone unanswered. Her brother reported her missing. But when police looked, they found nothing. No skid marks, no debris, not a single piece of evidence left behind on the bridge or the road. It was as if Emily had been swallowed by the night. At first, rumors spread fast in a small town. Some said she ran away. Others whispered about problems with her boyfriend, but none of it made sense. Emily had no reason to vanish. The case quickly became the focus of every news outlet in Minnesota. A young woman gone without a trace. Headlines screamed, "Where is Emily Carter?" Flyers with her picture covered gas stations, churches, and storefronts. But weeks turned into months, and then years. The investigation hit wall after wall. Detectives interviewed dozens of people. They looked at her ex-boyfriend. They looked at a neighbor with past disputes. But no evidence ever tied anyone to her disappearance. Every lead went cold. The case faded into the long list of unsolved missing persons. For Emily's family, it was torture. And then, 14 years later, everything changed. In the summer of 2025, the first days after Emily vanished felt slow and sharp. Duluth woke up to flyers on every pole and a single question on every screen. Where is Emily Carter? The town moved the way small towns do after a shock. People checked their doors twice. They looked over their shoulders in parking lots. Women changed their routines. They texted friends to get home in groups. Parents set curfews earlier. Coaches ended practice before dark. Churches added Emily's name to prayer lists. You could hear her name in grocery lines, coffee shops, and outside the post office. It was the same sentence over and over. She should have been home by midnight. Police held a short press briefing on day 2. They called it a welfare check that had turned into a missing person case. Reporters asked basic questions: last known location, the route home, any evidence on the bridge. The answers were thin. No skid marks, no debris, no phone activity after 11:36 p.m. The chief at the time, Thomas Greene, promised full resources. He stood behind the podium with a stack of notes he barely used. He said investigators were canvassing the North Shore Bridge and the nearby shoreline. He urged calm. He said there was no reason to believe the public was in danger. People did not buy that. By that evening, hardware stores ran low on deadbolts and pepper spray. 2 days passed. The search widened. Patrol cars cruised the shoreline and the access roads to the marinas. Boats went out, but the lake was choppy and the visibility was poor. Volunteers walked drainage ditches with flashlights. A local bait shop organized a shoreline sweep. They found nothing. No glass, no paint, no tire rubber. The lack of physical evidence made the community even more anxious. If a car had gone into the water, there should have been some trace. If a crime had happened, there should have been some sign. There was neither. Rumors filled the gap. The first wave focused on the ex-boyfriend, Jason Reed. People remembered arguments outside a campus cafe the previous spring. Someone repeated a story about a slammed door and raised voices. Police brought Jason in on day 3. He looked straight ahead and answered questions. He said he had been at a gas station across town at 11:45 p.m., then drove home and played a video game online until after midnight. Detectives checked the gas station footage. The timestamp matched. He was there when he said he was there. Officers pulled network logs from the gaming service. The login time matched his story. He was not near Emily when she disappeared. The department told the media that Jason was not a suspect at this time. It didn't matter. The talk in town moved slower than the facts. Some people kept pointing to him anyway. They wanted an answer, and his name was easy to reach. The next rumor landed on a neighbor, Frank Dwyer, a 68-year-old with a long memory and a short temper. Years earlier, he had argued with the Carter family about a fence line. He didn't like traffic on their shared alley. He complained about student parking. He had called code enforcement twice about trash bins. When Emily disappeared, some people said Frank must have snapped. Police knocked on his door. They asked to look around. He let them. They took his statement. He said he had been asleep by 10 p.m. His medical devices, plugged into a smart outlet, logged power draw all night. The timestamps backed him up. Officers found nothing in his garage or truck. No fresh scratches, no new dents, no signs of a cleanup. The rumor cooled, but not right away. Whispers don't vanish when a box gets checked. Meanwhile, the Carter family did everything they could. Emily's mother, Susan, spoke to reporters in clear, steady sentences. She asked for tips. She asked for respect. She asked people to stop speculating about her daughter's life. Emily's brother Matthew built a distribution line for flyers. He contacted the university, churches, and small businesses. He showed up at printers at dawn. He stapled posters to plywood fences and community boards. He worked with a friend to map where they had posted and where they needed to return. He told anyone who would listen that Emily was not the kind of person who disappeared on purpose, and he repeated the same details every time: her route, her last known time, the red Honda Civic, the short drive over the bridge. Local media amplified the case. Morning shows started with updates. The evening news led with search footage. Newspapers ran sidebars explaining the terrain, the currents, the hazards of Lake Superior. They quoted divers about how easy it is for a car to vanish in deep water and how hard it is to find it without a starting point. They interviewed a former highway patrol lieutenant who explained why there were no skid marks if a vehicle was nudged forward at low speed. The effect was twofold. People learned what investigators were up against. People also felt the investigation was stuck. On campus, the law school moved fast. Students set up a tip line and a digital form. They held a vigil at dusk with candles in paper cups and a photo of Emily on a folding table. The university extended late-night shuttle hours and added a second route past popular bars. Campus police increased patrols around lots and walking paths. A student group created a Facebook page with her flyer, her last outfit, her route, and a call for dashcam footage. Posts hit 10,000 shares in 2 days. Tips started coming in from outside Duluth. Sightings, hunches, copy and paste theories. Most were noise. A few Then came the tabloids and the recycled playbook. One site ran a piece suggesting academic pressure and relationship turmoil. Another repeated a claim that Emily had argued with a professor about a grade. None of it held up. The professor released emails that showed nothing out of the ordinary. Friends rolled their eyes at the turmoil angle. Susan Carter called the stories an insult. She told a reporter that her daughter's life would not be rewritten to fill empty space. The station aired her comment in full. The city's mood changed shape, but did not lift. Night joggers became morning joggers. A Pilates studio started a self-defense class. The diner on 4th Street offered coffee to volunteers and officers. The bar, where Emily had said goodbye at 11:30 p.m., put a jar on the counter to fund the flyer printings. At the marina, old men said the lake keeps secrets, and then they fell quiet. In the suburbs, people swapped security camera footage with neighbors. Some bought dash cams and LED floodlights. The practical steps made people feel useful. They did not bring a car out of the water. Inside the department, detectives built and rebuilt timelines. They drew a clean line at 11:30 p.m. when Emily left Harbor Lights, and another at 11:36 p.m. when her phone went dark. They plotted Jason's alibi and Frank's power usage. They overlaid patrol routes. They checked hospital admissions. They called tow companies and asked for logs of midnight calls. They pulled data from nearby license plate readers, though the net was thin that year. They requested state crime lab tests on paint chips found on guardrail ends near the bridge, but nothing matched anything new. Each negative result said the same thing. Whatever happened, it left almost no footprint on land. Greene's leadership style, controlled, selective, formal, grew unpopular. He avoided open-ended interviews. He gave prepared remarks and walked away. He told staff to speak with one voice, which meant few voices spoke at all. Families in cases like this often judge leaders by their willingness to stand with them publicly. The Carters felt distance. They did not say Greene was the problem. They said the silence was. Online, amateur sleuths began to say more. They criticized the first 12 hours. They mapped alternate routes from Harbor Lights and asked why all of them weren't searched immediately. They questioned why the bridge cameras captured little that night and whether maintenance logs existed. A local blogger published. By the end of the first week, patterns set in. Morning briefings, shoreline sweeps, phone dumps sorted and logged. A daily press update with not much to say. The second week brought less volunteer turnout and more side-eye in grocery aisles. The third week brought fewer headlines. The case had moved from event to condition. People learned to carry the question around while they did their errands. The Carter family refused to let the case slip from view. They set up a small table outside the library with flyers and ribbons. They kept the tip-line number simple and bold. They rotated shifts so one of them could be present at every press update, even when there were no updates. In the background, the campus sharpened its advocacy. Student government drafted a resolution calling for increased city-university coordination on late-night safety. They asked for a permanent budget line for shuttle expansion and requested routine lighting audits on the streets between campus and the waterfront. The resolution passed. The city agreed to more joint patrols. None of those measures could rewind the calendar to the night of September 3rd, but they did mark a shift. The town would not pretend this was random and unpreventable. As fall set in, Lake Superior grew colder and meaner. Any chance of sustained dive operations faded. The police acknowledged this in a memo. Underwater searches would pause until conditions improved. People heard that and thought, until spring. The Carters heard, not today. They kept the pressure on. They asked legislators for help sourcing better sonar when the thaw came. A state representative took their call. By now, the narrative had hardened enough to feel like a wall. It was not a clean accident. It was not a voluntary disappearance. It was not a kidnapping for ransom. It was not a lover's crime. People didn't have the language to say what it was, but they agreed on what it wasn't. They looked back at every choice Emily made that night and saw nothing reckless. The Carters stayed disciplined. They did not attack Greene by name. They asked for transparency. They asked for timelines. They asked for a review by the state, not because they accused the city of wrongdoing, but because they wanted the best available tools. A law professor helped them phrase the request. A local pastor helped them deliver it. It landed on desks in St. Paul with more signatures than anyone expected. 4 weeks in, the town's rituals stabilized. Candlelight on Thursdays. A morning coffee walk where neighbors checked on older residents. University reminders about shuttle hours blasted to inboxes. Social posts marking time. Day 15. Day 21. Day 28. A few businesses kept Emily's flyer at the register beside tip jars. Kids asked their parents why the lady on the paper wasn't home yet. Parents said they didn't know. This is how a disappearance becomes the air a place breathes. It changes how people drive past the bridge and how they listen to the wind off the water. It changes the volume at the bar when the news comes on. It changes who gets the benefit of the doubt. Every empty day adds weight to the same simple fact. A clear route, a short drive, a bright red car, and nothing to show for it. By late October, the case file had grown thick with interviews, grid maps, and lab reports that said, no match. The department scheduled fewer briefings. The city scheduled more listening sessions. The chief repeated that leads would be pursued as long as leads existed. The Carters kept placing new posters over sun-bleached ones. Students kept the Facebook page active and pinned a post with a clean timeline and a list of confirmed facts. They ended the post with a single line in bold. If you saw anything on the North Shore Bridge after 11:30 p.m. on September 3rd, contact us. Part 2 of Emily's story closes with a 14 years pass. The case file gathers dust. The name stays on a bulletin board, then slips to a drawer. People in Duluth still remember the night, but the story fades to a rumor. Each September, a short article runs with an old photo and the same line, still missing. The family keeps candles and a framed picture by the window. They hold a small vigil on the shore. Hope shrinks, not with a crash, but with a steady grind of days. The North Shore Bridge stands where it always has, steel over dark water. Locals point to it when the sky turns gray and say, "This is where the mystery begins." In the summer of 2025, an email lands in a city clerk's inbox. A volunteer dive team plans a lake cleanup. The group is called Deep Waters Recovery. They work with sonar, lift bags, and a small pontoon. They are not police. They are not making a TV show. They travel town to town to pull junk from water. Their lead is Derek Lawson, a quiet former sailor with a habit of checking every cable twice. The city invites them to Duluth. The brief is simple. Scan the area near the bridge, mark what you find, remove what you safely can. The team arrives with a van full of gear, sonar fish finders, underwater lights, dry suits. They launch from a public ramp just after sunrise. The weather is clear and cold. Wind cuts across Lake Superior and turns faces red. Derek sets a search grid on a tablet and points to a rectangle under the bridge. They start slow. The sonar pings and draws pale lines on the screen. Old logs, scrap metal, a length of chain. Here and there, boxy shapes that might be appliances. They mark them for later. Mid-morning, the screen shows something different. The return is crisp, not scattered. A long shape, symmetric left to right. Not a boat. At 40 feet, the light dims. At 60 feet, the lake closes around him. He follows the rope hand over hand and watches silt rise from the bottom like smoke. The shape appears ahead, flat and dark. He sees a corner of a bumper, then a spread of glass peppered with algae. He sweeps the light across the rear panel. The paint used to be red. Now it is a rust-streaked brown with green seams. He feels along the trunk lip until his fingers hit a recessed rectangle. He wipes at it with a gloved thumb. Bubbles blow from his regulator as he scrubs harder. Letters push through the mud. He reads the sequence once. He reads it again. It matches the plate from the missing person bulletin. He writes the plate on the slate in block print. He radios once to the surface. Tag matches. The boat above him goes quiet. He circles the car. The windows are closed. The roof seems intact. The rear panel has a shallow crater the size of a steering wheel. The taillight is fractured but still embedded. He finds no open doors, no obvious tear in metal. He does not tug. He does not pry. This is a scene, not scrap. He clips a small yellow tag to the tow hook and ties the downline to it. He takes 4 slow video sweeps from the corners and a final close shot of the plate. Then he starts up the line. On the surface, he pulls off his hood and gives a simple order. Do not touch the car again until police arrive. But he also knows what happens when you call first and wait. Currents shift, silt moves. A storm can come from nowhere on Lake Superior. If they leave it, the car could slide deeper into the trench. He decides on a compromise. They will not open the vehicle. They will not alter it. They will stabilize it and be ready to lift only if police approve. He radios the Duluth police and the county sheriff, names the plate, cites the depth, and asks for a supervisor at the dock. Then he and the team rig lift bags to the downline and stand by with the air supply closed. Patrol cars arrive in under 20 minutes. A sergeant climbs aboard, listens, and makes a call. The chief investigator wants to see the sonar and the video. Derek plays the footage. Plate numbers, rear dent, closed doors. The sergeant looks rattled and then very focused. He asks if a controlled lift can be done without opening the car or changing its position. Derek says yes. They can cradle the chassis, distribute the load, and let the water carry the weight up. The sergeant nods. He signs a short authorization on a field form, radios for more units, and calls the medical examiner. No one cheers. No one speaks above a murmur. The lake slaps the hull. The team inflates the lift bags inch by inch. The surface swells and eddies. Police push the crowd back and tape the pier. Sirens fade in and out as more units arrive. The car settles into a sling and drips brown water. A flatbed backs down the ramp. The driver winches the load forward. Every chain is checked. A tarp is draped, but not tied. Officers repeat the same line to anyone near the tape. Please step back. This is an active scene. Reporters pull up and point lenses at the waterline. The shoe bumps against the pier and hangs there, soaked and heavy. An old man on the seawall takes off his cap and rubs his eyes. The family gets a call before the evening news. A detective speaks to the brother first. He does not say the words you want to hear. He says, "There has been a development," and asks them to meet at the lake with a support officer present. They arrive as the last light leaves the water. The car is already on the flatbed, wheels still dripping, plate visible under a skin of algae. The mother does not touch the tarp. She stares at the outline and nods. The brother holds the rail with both hands and leans over, as if he could will the lake to give a different answer. Police escort them to a tent and explain what happens next. Secure transport, a sealed bay, a full forensic exam. No promises, No guesses. Only process. Word spreads through Minnesota before midnight. The clip runs on every newscast. A rusted sedan. A tarp. A line of officers with gloved hands. The anchors say the same phrase in different tones. A car linked to the 2011 disappearance surfaced today near the North Shore Bridge. Social media fills with maps, and then with photos of Emily at 23. The comments are a flood of sadness and relief and anger. The better ones say, "Finally." The worse ones speculate. The police public information officer releases a brief statement. Recovery of a vehicle consistent with the missing persons case. Request for patience. Pledge to examine evidence thoroughly. What the recovery changes is everything that matters. For 14 years, the case had no physical anchor. Now it has metal, glass, paint, and bolts. It has a plate. It has a path from the bridge to a point on the lake bed. It has surfaces that can hold trace. It has cavities that can trap fibers. It has crushed zones that can tell direction and force. The team logs the recovery time to the minute. The county logs chain of custody line by line. The car becomes a sealed box of answers waiting to be read. By morning, the case is not a rumor. It is a line of facts. A sonar hit at 70 feet. A plate match on the lake bed. A controlled lift with law enforcement present. A vehicle that corresponds to the one listed in a missing person report from 2011. A visible rear impact on the trunk area. Closed windows at recovery. No major deformation to the roof. Those details point away from a simple swerve or slide. They point toward a push. Investigators do not say this on camera yet. They say they will examine the car and release findings. But everyone who watches the footage of the dent draws the same breath. The recovery changes the mood in Duluth in a different way, too. People who had rolled their eyes at any mention of the case start talking in straight sentences. A barista lowers the radio when the noon news plays the clip. A bus driver shakes his head and says he has driven the bridge for 20 years and never seen anything like this. A city worker stands with a coffee by the guardrail and stares at the flat water. The bridge is still a bridge. The lake is still a lake. But the place is now a scene, and the scene has a date, a plate, and a chain of custody. Late that day, police release one more line. The vehicle is a Honda Civic registered to the Carter family. They will not say anything about remains before the medical examiner's exam. They ask for privacy. They ask for patience. They do not get much of either. The family posts a short note online. "Thank you for your prayers. Please do not show up at the house. We will speak when we can." A friend sets flowers at the base of a light pole by the ramp. 2 candles flicker and go out in the wind. Inside the forensic bay, the car stands over a catch pan as lake water drips out in slow taps. Technicians in white suits photograph every angle before anyone lays a hand on metal. They log silt samples from the wheel wells. They swab for paint transfer on the dent. They bag debris from the trunk seam. They cut the battery cable to prevent any short in the wiring, and then pop the hood under a camera. They avoid the doors until the coroner is present. Every step is slow, recorded, and timed. But that is the next chapter. For now, Part 3 ends at the moment a town watches a shape rise from water and understands, without being told, that the silence is broken, not with a theory, not with hearsay, with steel, with a license plate under a skin of algae, with a shoe that should have walked into a law career and never did. The case moves in homes across Duluth. People sit with the same thought. The mystery did not vanish. It sank. Now it has a tow line and a chain tag. Tomorrow brings the lab, the reports, the comparisons, the names. Tonight, the facts hold. A volunteer team came to clean a lake. They found a car. They followed procedure. They lifted it with police watching. And for the first time since 2011, the Carter family has something more than a date on a calendar. They have a starting point. The final image of the day is simple. A flatbed rolls away under a gray sky. A tarp flaps once and then settles. A squad car follows with its light bar off. The bridge recedes in the mirror. The water closes again. The night takes the pier back. The silence is not empty anymore. It has weight. It has a V-I-N. It has a root to the truth. If this story gripped you, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. The recovery of Emily Carter's car was just the beginning. In the next part, we'll follow the forensic team as they open the vehicle, uncover hidden evidence, and piece together what really happened on that bridge. Stay with us, because the truth is finally rising to the surface. The discovery at Lake Superior sent shockwaves across Minnesota. What began as a quiet mission to lift an old vehicle from the lake turned into the breakthrough the Carter family had waited 14 long years for. As the red Honda Civic broke the surface of the cold water, the sight was haunting. Covered in rust, wrapped in weeds, weighed down by years of silence. The car was no longer just a vehicle. It was a crime scene, frozen in time. Police from Duluth and state troopers rushed to the harbor. Yellow tape was stretched across the pier. The vehicle was declared evidence, and every inch of ground became restricted. Crowds gathered quickly. News traveled fast in a small city like Duluth. Dozens of onlookers held up their phones, capturing video, whispering, some gasping out loud. For years, people had speculated what happened to Emily Carter. Now, part of the answer sat dripping in front of them. Officers moved the crowd back, warning that no one could interfere. Reporters scrambled for position. Camera lights lit up the night air. The silence of a cold case had just been broken, and the public wanted to see it unfold in real time. A tow truck fitted for heavy salvage was backed onto the pier. The Civic was lifted slowly, wrapped in thick straps, and lowered onto the flatbed. A black tarp was pulled tightly over it. Police insisted this was no longer speculation. This was evidence, and it had to be preserved exactly as it was. Every dent, every trace of mud, every inch of broken glass could speak to what happened that night in 2011. The convoy set out toward the St. Louis County Forensic Center. Lights from the escort cars flashed red and blue as they cut through Duluth. Behind them followed the Carter family, silent in their vehicle, knowing what they were about to face. News outlets carried the footage live. The line at the bottom of the screen read, "Possible break-in 14-year-old Carter case." Minnesota was awake, watching. At the forensic center, the Civic was rolled into a sealed garage. Crime scene specialists gathered, cameras in hand, gloves on, ready to record every detail. When the door was opened, a foul smell of mud, rust, and decay spilled out. It was the smell of time trapped underwater. In the driver's seat sat skeletal remains. A human figure slumped forward, hair still caught in the fractured windshield. The bones were fragile but unmistakably human. On the floor, a leather wallet. On the passenger seat, a broken cell phone. Around the neck bones, a chain necklace still intact. These items were cross-checked against old photos and records. There was no doubt. This was Emily Carter. For 14 years, the question had been, where is Emily? Now the question changed to, who put her here? News of the identification was delivered directly to Susan Carter and her son Matthew. Susan collapsed when she heard the confirmation. Paramedics at the scene rushed to help her. Matthew stood beside her, overwhelmed, repeating the words, Forensic experts stated their first impressions clearly. This was not an accident. The Civic had been hit from behind. The force had pushed it forward, leaving Emily no time to react. It was a deliberate act. The car had not simply veered off the road into the water. It had been forced. With Emily inside, alive, conscious, and unable to escape, what had once been filed as a mysterious disappearance was now officially classified as a homicide investigation. The revelation detonated across Minnesota. Every news channel led with the same story. The ghost of Lake Superior finally speaks. That was the phrase printed in bold across the Duluth Herald. Talk shows replayed the footage of the car being lifted from the water. Social media exploded with theories, questions, and outrage. The state had lived with Emily Carter's name for 14 years. Now they had pictures, evidence, and a new truth. Someone had killed her. The next question demanded an answer. Who? The discovery shook Duluth to its core. A candlelight vigil was held outside the university Emily once attended. Students held signs that read, "Justice for Emily." Professors who remembered her stood side by side with teenagers who only knew the story from whispers. At churches, prayers were offered. At coffee shops, conversations hushed when her name was spoken. Everyone in Duluth knew the story. Everyone had an opinion. Some cried for closure. Others grew angry that it had taken this long. Many demanded the police deliver answers, not more questions. For the Carter family, the grief was fresh, but so was determination. They told reporters, "We are not done." Finding her car is only the beginning. We want to know who did this. The Civic was not just an old car pulled from a lake. It was a sealed container of evidence. Investigators now had physical... By the end of that night, the Civic was sealed inside a forensic bay. The doors were locked. Guards were posted. Every move would be recorded. Images of the rust-stained car, the shattered glass, and the remains inside spread across Minnesota. They were not easy to look at. They were not meant to be. They were a reminder of the truth people had avoided. Emily Carter had been murdered. The disappearance was no longer a mystery. It was a crime. And now the car itself was speaking louder than any rumor or theory ever had. The Carter case had entered a new phase. The questions grew sharper, the suspects fewer, the trail clearer. The world now asked what hidden marks inside that Honda Civic would point to the person who ended Emily's life. The rusted Honda Civic sat inside the St. Louis County Forensic Garage. 14 years of silence had ended, but the car itself still had more to say. Investigators surrounded the vehicle, cameras in hand, gloves on, marking every detail. The team knew that whatever they found here would determine whether Emily Carter's case remained a mystery or became a full criminal prosecution. The first step was a complete forensic sweep. Mud and algae coated almost every surface. Technicians scraped samples for chemical testing. They collected small flakes of metal that had corroded but still carried information about how the car had been damaged. Every inch of the vehicle was photographed. The windshield, cracked in a starburst pattern, was carefully measured. Experts later confirmed it was consistent with a powerful frontal impact. At the back of the car, the damage was even clearer. A deep dent pushed into the trunk and rear bumper, the kind of force that only comes from another vehicle slamming directly into it. Technicians traced the contours of the dent, documenting it from multiple angles. There was no mistaking what it showed. Emily's car had been rammed. Among the scratches and dents, investigators noticed something else. A thin layer of black paint stuck to the Civic's rear bumper. It was different from the car's original red finish. The team carefully scraped the fragments, sealed them in containers, and sent them to the state crime lab. Weeks later, the lab reported the finding. The paint matched the industrial coating used on Dodge Ram trucks manufactured in 2004. That detail immediately shifted the focus. Detectives turned to the Minnesota DMV records. They searched for Dodge Ram pickups registered in the Duluth area in 2011. The list was long, but one entry jumped off the page. A black Dodge Ram 2004 registered to none other than Thomas Greene, the sheriff of Duluth at the time Emily disappeared. The discovery stunned investigators. Greene wasn't just a random name. He had been the... At the same time, a separate digital search brought another breakthrough. Technicians re-examined archived traffic radar data from September 3, 2011, the night Emily vanished. These files had been overlooked during the original investigation. In a backup server, a radar log revealed that a Dodge Ram pickup, matching Greene's registration, crossed the North Shore Bridge minutes after Emily's Honda Civic was last seen. That entry had never appeared in the official 2011 case file. Whether it was deliberately hidden or incompetently discarded, the fact was clear. Greene's truck was at the exact place Emily vanished. More evidence soon surfaced. Investigators interviewed Emily's best friend, who still had access to old emails. One stood out, sent by Emily the night before she disappeared. It read, "I think someone is following me. A black truck keeps driving behind me." 14 years later, those words took on devastating clarity. For investigators, the puzzle pieces were finally aligning. The dent in the Civic, the black paint linked to a Dodge Ram 2004, the DMV record pointing to Greene's ownership, the fake bill of sale, the radar log placing the truck at the bridge, and Emily's final email describing a black pickup trailing her. Each clue supported the next, creating a chain that led in one direction. The Carter family was briefed on the findings. When told that Greene, the very sheriff who had promised justice, was now the prime suspect, they were shocked. Emily's mother broke down in tears, recalling how Greene had shaken her hand in 2011 and assured her the department was doing everything possible. Her brother Matthew spoke bluntly. "He stood in front of us and lied. All along he was covering his tracks." News of the revelations leaked quickly. Duluth, already scarred by years of unanswered questions, erupted with anger. As the investigation deepened, more troubling details emerged. Witnesses recalled Greene driving a black Dodge Ram long after he supposedly sold it. One former mechanic said he repaired the truck in 2013, 2 years after the paperwork claimed it was no longer Greene's. Another witness, a retired deputy, remembered Greene warning others not to dig too deep into Emily Carter's case. At the time, the comments seemed like frustration. Now, They looked like a deliberate cover-up. The case file from 2011 was also re-examined. Key documents were missing. The radar report had been stripped from the main binder. Notes about possible vehicle involvement were gone. In their place were generic statements about Emily possibly running away or getting into an accident. The omissions were glaring. Investigators concluded that only someone with authority over the case could have removed or altered the evidence. Again, all roads led to Greene. Forensic experts returned to the Civic for another round of analysis. They lifted partial DNA samples from the steering wheel and the inside of the driver's door. Most of the material belonged to Emily, as expected, but trace elements suggested the presence of another contributor. The degraded sample was too faint for a full profile, but the markers that could be tested did not exclude Greene. Prosecutors knew the DNA evidence was weak on its own, but combined with the other findings, it strengthened the narrative that Emily had not been alone that night. As all these pieces of evidence came together, the picture was no longer ambiguous. Emily Carter hadn't driven off the bridge by mistake. Her car had been rammed by another vehicle, forced off the road, and pushed into the depths of Lake Superior. The black Dodge Ram 2004 tied to Sheriff Thomas Greene was at the center of it all. The Carter family, once left in silence, now faced the bitter truth that the very institution meant to protect them had concealed the crime. By the end of 2025, the narrative was undeniable. Greene, once the sheriff leading the search for Emily, was now the prime suspect in her murder. The case had transformed from a missing persons mystery into a homicide investigation aimed squarely at the man who had buried the truth. It took 14 years to reach this moment. 14 years of unanswered questions, cold files, and silence. Now, with evidence mounting against former Duluth Sheriff Thomas Greene, the walls finally closed in. The arrest would change everything, not only for the Carter family, but for the entire state of Minnesota. After weeks of reviewing the newly uncovered evidence, the Minnesota Attorney General's office signed the arrest warrant. The FBI, already involved since the discovery of Emily's car, coordinated with the state police to avoid any hint of local bias. Investigators knew this was no ordinary arrest. Greene wasn't just another suspect. He had once been the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in Duluth. He had worn the badge, given press conferences, shaken hands with governors, and promised the Carter family that he would find Emily. Now, he was accused of being the very man who put her in the water. The warrant covered not only Greene's arrest, but also the search of his house, vehicles, and any storage units he might have owned. Agents suspected he had destroyed evidence years ago, but even small traces, a firearm, old documents, hidden digital files, could still tie him to the crime. For Duluth, this was history in the making. Never before had a former sheriff been charged with first-degree murder. On the morning of August 2nd, 2025, at exactly 5 a.m., unmarked FBI SUVs rolled quietly into Greene's quiet suburban neighborhood. The plan was simple: a pre-dawn arrest, minimizing attention before the press could swarm. But there are no secrets in small towns. By sunrise, television crews had descended on the block. Reporters shoved microphones at anyone willing to talk. "He was a hero here," one neighbor said. "He saved a kid from drowning back in the 90s. He helped during the floods. To think he killed Emily. I can't believe it." Another voice was harsher. "He fooled us. He led the investigation while covering his own tracks. He betrayed every single one of us. The split reaction mirrored what was to come. Duluth would find itself torn between those who clung to Greene's reputation and those who saw him now as a wolf hiding in plain sight. At 5:30 a.m., the Carter family received a call from investigators. The words they had waited over a decade to hear finally came. Thomas Greene had been arrested. Susan Carter, Emily's mother, wept uncontrollably. In her first statement, she said, "After 14 years, maybe justice has finally begun. My daughter's voice has been silent for too long. Now we hope the truth will be heard." Matthew Carter, Emily's older brother, spoke with reporters later that morning. His message was steady but emotional. "We've lived every day waiting for this. We never stopped believing that Emily deserved justice. Today we finally feel the system has started to listen." For the Carters, the arrest was both relief and renewed grief. They had found Emily's car. They had confirmed her death. Now the man accused of killing her was behind bars. The weight of the years pressed down, but the path toward accountability had opened. By 8 a.m., Minnesota's largest networks were airing live coverage of Greene's arrest. Helicopters hovered over Duluth. Satellite trucks lined the streets. The headlines screamed across screens. Former sheriff arrested in Emily Carter case. From lawman to suspect, the fall of Thomas Greene. Justice after 14 years. Talk shows debated the case within hours. How could a sheriff have slipped through the cracks? How had he led the investigation while hiding his role? What did this say about oversight in small-town law enforcement? National outlets picked up the story by noon. CNN, NBC, Fox, and CBS all carried segments on Greene. By evening, the arrest dominated primetime. In every broadcast, one image repeated: Greene in handcuffs, eyes down, being led into custody. As the news spread, Duluth erupted in conversation. Coffee shops, churches, workplaces, and online forums filled with debate. A small but vocal group defended Greene. "The man gave 30 years to this community," one supporter argued. "We don't know all the facts. Maybe this is a witch hunt." But most people felt anger and betrayal. "He was supposed to protect us," a Duluth resident said. "Instead, he used his badge to hide murder." Social media lit up with hashtags. Hashtag Justice for Emily. Hashtag Sheriff Greene. Hashtag Truth at Last. Arguments flared online, sometimes viciously. Families split over dinner tables. Old friendships strained. The community itself seemed to fracture under the weight of the revelations. 2 days after the arrest, the Carters stood before cameras at a small press conference. Matthew read from a prepared statement. "We are not here for revenge. We are here for justice. Emily was taken from us in a cruel, deliberate act. We trust the courts to reveal the truth. We ask everyone watching, do not forget her. Do not let her story fade again." The statement struck a chord across Minnesota. News anchors replayed it. Within 48 hours, prosecutors held a press conference. Standing behind a row of microphones, the Attorney General of Minnesota delivered the news. "Thomas Greene is hereby charged with 1 count of first-degree murder in the death of Emily Carter. He is further charged with obstruction of justice and falsification of official records." Reporters shouted questions, but the message was clear. The man who had once sworn to uphold the law now stood accused of violating it in the most profound way. Greene faced the possibility of life in prison without parole. The trial date was set for December 2025. For the first time, Duluth knew when answers might finally come. The shockwave spread quickly. That same evening, hundreds gathered in downtown Duluth for a candlelight vigil. People held signs reading, "Justice for Emily" and "We believe the Carters." The family attended, standing quietly as the crowd chanted Emily's name. Churches opened their doors for prayer services. Universities held safety forums. The state legislature announced hearings on police accountability. In coffee shops and living rooms, people asked the same question. How had Greene escaped justice for so long? For many, the arrest was more than the downfall of one man. It was a reckoning with trust, authority, and the failures of oversight. The arrest of Thomas Greene marked a turning point in the Emily Carter case. What had once been a cold file buried in archives was now a headline case on every screen in America. From sheriff to suspect, Greene's fall was almost unbelievable. But the evidence told the story. Paint on Emily's car, radar data, a falsified vehicle sale, an email from Emily herself. It all pointed to the man who was supposed to protect her. Now, with Greene in custody, attention shifted to the courtroom. The trial loomed ahead, promising to expose every hidden truth. For Duluth, the prosecution wasted no time. In their opening statement, they declared with force, this was not an accident. This was not a case of negligence. This was an execution. Thomas Greene used his power, his position, and his knowledge of the system to kill Emily Carter and bury the truth. The words hit the room like a hammer. Greene's defense team countered with calm voices. They insisted there was no direct evidence. They claimed Greene was a victim of circumstantial coincidences, scapegoated after 14 years of unsolved mystery. But the atmosphere was heavy. The public wanted answers. The Carter family wanted justice. And for the first time, the system was ready to deliver it. The indictment was read. Count 1, first-degree murder in the death of Emily Carter. Count 2, obstruction of justice and falsification of official records. If convicted, Greene faced life in prison without parole. The jury, 12 men and women, sat in silence. They had been carefully selected, questioned for days about bias, their views on law enforcement, their feelings about unsolved crimes. Now, they carried the responsibility of deciding the fate of a man who had once been the most powerful figure in Duluth. From the very first day, the tension was thick. Everyone knew the evidence would either shatter Greene's defense or collapse under its own weight. The prosecution called its experts. Forensic scientists took the stand, explaining step by step how the car had been analyzed. They showed images of the Honda Civic recovered from Lake Superior. They pointed to the deep dent in the rear of the vehicle. Paint samples were collected from that dent. Under magnification, those samples revealed a black automotive coating. When tested against the national database, the match was clear. Dodge Ram, 2004. Next came the records from the Department of Motor Vehicles. The registered owner of a black Dodge Ram 2004 in Duluth at the time? Thomas Greene. The jury listened carefully as technicians displayed charts, side-by-side comparisons, and photographs of the paint match. The conclusion was unavoidable. The truck that had slammed into Emily's car belonged to the sheriff himself. Then came the radar data. A transportation officer testified that traffic monitoring logs from September 3, 2011 had been preserved in backup servers. Those records showed Greene's Dodge Ram passing over the North Shore Bridge at 11:36 p.m., the very window when Emily's car vanished. But those same records had been missing from the original police file. deleted, altered, covered up. The officer paused, looking at the jury. There is only one person who had both the motive and the authority to remove those documents: Sheriff Thomas Greene. The courtroom stirred. Family members wept. The timeline was coming together, piece by piece. Then came the most haunting evidence of all: Emily's final email. Her best friend, Sarah Mitchell, took the stand. She held a printed copy of the message that Emily had sent her just hours before she disappeared. The courtroom grew still as the words were read aloud. I think someone is following me. A black truck keeps driving behind me. Sarah's voice cracked, but she finished. Witness after witness was called. A clerk from City Hall pointed directly to Greene's signature on the falsified paperwork showing his Dodge Ram had been sold in 2012. The document was a photocopy, no original, filled with inconsistencies. The ink, the date, the lack of an official seal. The jury could see it with their own eyes. A former deputy recalled how Greene became defensive and angry whenever the Carter case was mentioned in later years. He didn't want anyone reopening it. He said it was closed and we should leave it alone. A neighbor testified that Greene once bragged after a night of drinking, "Nobody's ever going to find that car." Each statement tightened the noose. Each voice added weight to the story the evidence was telling. The prosecution then tied it all together. They laid out the timeline. Emily leaves the Harbor Lights bar at 11:30 p.m. She drives across the North Shore Bridge. Greene follows in his black Dodge Ram. He rams her car from behind. The Civic crashes, forced into the icy depths of Lake Superior. Emily dies on impact or within minutes. Greene returns home, erases the radar logs, forges paperwork to sell the truck, and orders his department to treat the case as a disappearance, not a homicide. It was a plan only a sheriff could pull off, and it worked for 14 years. But in 2025, sonar, persistence, and truth finally caught up. The defense fought back. They hammered on the lack of direct evidence. No one saw Thomas Greene behind the wheel that night, the lead attorney declared. No camera captured him ramming Emily Carter's car. No fingerprints survived 14 years underwater. No weapon was found. This is a case built on speculation. They suggested the paint could have come from another Dodge Ram. The radar system, they said, could have produced errors. The email from Emily, they argued, only showed her fear, not the identity of her killer. They painted Greene as a victim of public outrage, a man sacrificed to satisfy a community's hunger for closure. But the argument felt thin. Day after day, the trial unfolded like a slow storm. The gallery filled with reporters, families, students, even strangers who had never known Emily but felt bound to her story. Every photograph of the rusted Honda Civic projected on the courtroom screen deepened the silence. Every word from the Carter family reminded the jury why they were there. Reporters outside the courthouse typed headlines in real time. From sheriff to suspect, the trial of a fallen lawman, justice for Emily Carter. Television channels replayed the haunting image of the car being lifted from the water over and over again, as if the entire nation needed to see the proof. Inside the courtroom, the tension was unbearable. The faces of the jurors betrayed the weight of their task. Then came the closing arguments. The prosecutor stood, voice firm but heavy. This was not a mistake. This was not a tragedy of chance. This was deliberate. Thomas Greene killed Emily Carter. He abused his badge, his authority, and the trust of this community to cover his crime. For 14 years he lived free, while her family lived in torment. Today, you hold the power to end that injustice. Do not let him escape again. The words soaked through the chamber. The defense replied, calm, steady, appealing to doubt. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, do not be swept away by emotion. There is no direct proof that my client pushed that car into the lake. There is no video, no eyewitness, no confession. This case is built on assumptions, stacked on assumptions. If you convict on that, then no one is safe. The jury listened, faces unreadable. When the final words were spoken, the case was in their hands. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Outside, crowds gathered, holding candles, chanting Emily's name, waiting for news. The Carter family remained inside, silent, holding hands. At last, the jury returned. The foreman stood. The courtroom rose. The verdict was read. On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Thomas Greene, guilty. On the charge of obstruction of justice, we find the defendant guilty. Gasps filled the room. The Carter family broke down, tears streaming. The gallery erupted in sobs, shouts, and applause. Outside, the crowd cheered. Greene sat motionless. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the floor. He showed no reaction. The gavel struck. Order restored. The judge leaned forward. Thomas Greene, for the murder of Emily Carter and for obstructing justice, this court sentences you to life. The verdict was in. Thomas Greene, once the sheriff of Duluth, was convicted of first-degree murder and obstruction of justice. The gavel had fallen. The Carter family finally had their answer. But the story did not end inside the courtroom. The immediate reaction in Duluth was raw. Outside the courthouse, crowds cheered as word spread that Greene would never walk free again. People hugged each other. Some cried openly, not only for Emily but for the years their town had lived under the shadow of silence. For the Carter family, the moment was heavy with relief and pain in equal measure. Susan Carter, Emily's mother, told reporters, "We never wanted revenge. We only wanted the truth. And now we have it." Her words echoed through Minnesota. Matthew Carter, Emily's older brother, spoke in a trembling voice. 14 years. 14 years of not knowing. Today my sister finally gets justice. It was the closure they had fought for, but closure did not erase the loss. In the days that followed, Duluth organized vigils. Hundreds gathered at the steps of City Hall, holding candles as Emily's photograph was projected onto a screen. The community that had once been divided by fear was now united in grief and remembrance. Emily was reburied in a larger ceremony, this time not as a missing person, but as a victim whose truth had finally been told. Hundreds attended, friends, classmates, neighbors, strangers who had followed the case. Rows of flowers lined the church. 36 law students from her university carried candles, honoring the young woman who had dreamed of practicing law but never had the chance. The moment was both heartbreaking and powerful. Emily's life had been cut short, but her name had changed the course of justice. The group, Deep Waters Recovery, whose sonar search had uncovered Emily's car, was honored in Duluth and later across the state. Their work, originally focused on environmental cleanup, had altered the outcome of a cold case that once seemed unsolvable. Derek Lawson, the leader of the team, spoke humbly. We never imagined we'd be the ones to find her. We were just doing what we always do, looking for what's been forgotten under the water. This time, what we found changed everything. The team was recognized by the governor of Minnesota for their service. Their discovery reignited national conversations about how volunteer groups and technology could play vital roles in solving cold cases. Meanwhile, the justice system itself was forced to look inward. The fact that Greene, as sheriff, had led the original investigation in 2011, while secretly hiding his own guilt, shook public trust. Editorials across the country asked the same question: how many other cases were compromised? In response, the Minnesota legislature introduced new policies. Independent oversight boards were created to monitor police investigations, ensuring no single individual could bury evidence. Cases involving missing persons would now receive automatic review from state-level investigators, not just local police. The Emily Carter case became a blueprint for reform. National media labeled it one of the most important cold cases solved in recent decades. Documentaries and news specials aired, revisiting every twist and turn, from the night of Emily's disappearance to the sonar discovery in 2025 to Greene's arrest and conviction. But at the heart of every program was the same truth. A young woman had lost her life, and the person tasked with protecting her had been the one who betrayed her. Inside Duluth, the impact was personal. Some residents struggled with guilt for ever doubting Emily's family. Others admitted they had once defended Greene, believing the sheriff could never be capable of such. For law students at Emily's university, her story became a lesson. Professors wove the case into lectures about ethics, justice, and the failures of authority. Some students even carried ribbons in her honor at graduation, reminding themselves why accountability matters in the law. The story of Emily Carter wasn't just history. It became part of the education of the next generation of lawyers. As for Greene, his downfall became a warning. Once celebrated as a strong sheriff, he had used his position to cover up murder. His conviction reminded people everywhere that no one, no matter how powerful, is above accountability. Prison records later confirmed Greene adjusted poorly to incarceration. Once a man who commanded authority, he now lived among inmates who despised him for his past as law enforcement. His silence after the trial spoke volumes. He never appealed his conviction. He never confessed. He remained a symbol of betrayal until the end of his life. Emily's story also reshaped how people viewed cold cases. Families across the U.S. who had loved ones missing reached out to the Carters. Many said the discovery of Emily's car gave them hope. If justice could come after 14 years, maybe it could come for them too. Across Minnesota, more funding was directed into reviewing old disappearances. Sonar teams were invited to collaborate on other unsolved cases. For some families, Emily's case became the light that proved the past could still speak. The cultural impact was deep. National news networks called the story a parable of trust broken and trust rebuilt. Podcasts devoted entire seasons to unraveling the Carter case. Social media carried hashtags like #JusticeForEmily, spreading far beyond Minnesota. In town squares, in classrooms, in police academies, the name Emily Carter became shorthand for both tragedy and accountability. But for the Carter family, the most important part, the lessons were clear. Power must always be checked. Families must never give up. Communities must demand answers, even when those answers feel impossible. And the truth, no matter how long it takes, has a way of surfacing. Emily Carter's story proved all of it. And so, Duluth finally moved forward, not forgetting, but living with the truth revealed. The Carter family found peace, though never freedom from grief. And Thomas Greene, once their sheriff, would die behind bars. The shadow over Lake Superior had finally lifted. If this story gripped you as much as it gripped the people of Minnesota, make sure you subscribe to the channel. More cases like this, stories of truth finally uncovered, justice finally delivered, are coming next. Don't miss the next chapter. Hit subscribe and join us as we continue to expose the mysteries that refuse to stay buried.